So we were discussing environmental laws, forest laws, legislations, and policies. So I gave you a format yesterday that, India still has Indian Forest Act 1927 wala. This was followed by Forest Conservation Act. This was in 1980. We have a National Forest Policy 1952, National Forest Policy 1988. Then we have the Forest Rights Act 2006. And now we have the draft National Policy 2018-19. So ये कुछ नाम आपको याद रखना पड़ेगा. You must remember these names. And this was an act related to timber trade. Timber trade, it was about revenue generation. It was about restricting the access for the local populations. And this act was essentially about British interests. And this we continued after independence also. Okay, so this has continued. Now this Conservation Act, this was primarily for reducing loss of forest, for reducing diversion of forest land to non-forest uses. So there is an element of ecology in this. The first one was more about economy, it was more about revenues, whereas this one was more about ecology, forest conservation. But this also did not acknowledge the role of the local tribals as much. Now, the 52 policy and 88 policy, these policies were more focused on social rights. They were talking about social forestry, allowing access for grazing, allowing access for firewood. This was more about the social issues here. And 1988 policy, in many ways, was a fairly balanced policy. This policy was supposed to encourage private participation. A very important element of this policy, 88 policy, was it started talking about participation by the locals. It starts talking about community conservation efforts. National Forest Policy 88 wala jo hai, it is more about talking about social forestry. Social forestry as an idea was mooted in 1952. It allows for grazing. It allows for firewood. It talks about fort recollection. And the 88 policy was a very balanced policy, that was taking care of the local needs along with conservation. And a very important initiation of 88 policy was it started encouraging local participation, community-based participation. It started acknowledging the role of local tribes, the indigenous tribes, their rights and also their conservation. And based on this experience, the Forest Rights Act 2006 was passed. Now this in many ways was a landmark. Keep jotting, keep noting down as I speak, So the policy followed by the Forest Rights Act, 2006. This was very, very important because देखो ये दोनों policies हैं. These two are policies. This is not actually a law. This is more like a blueprint. This is more like suggestions. The government may or may not accept it. In fact, most of the provisions of these policies were not really taken up by the government for implementation. They remained as ideas, maybe some experimental programs, but as such no compliance issues with policies. But whereas the Forest Act, this was a legislation. This was a proper act that mandated that the government has to play a role in assuring the rights on the forest lands. So 2006, this was an act, followed by this draft one. So this is more or less the quick snapshot of how the laws have evolved. Now I will detail this a bit more. As we are moving on, I'll detail a bit more because I'm expecting they can ask you a question around forest policies. Write down a question, please. Write down a question so that you know what I am discussing. While forests are critical to ecological protection and conservation. The dependence of local communities on forests cannot be compromised. Give a critical account of how forest laws and policies have fared in trying to balance social objectives with ecological and economic goals. While forests are critical to ecological protection and conservation, the dependence of local communities on forests cannot be compromised. Give a critical account of how forest laws and policies have fared in trying to balance social objectives with ecological and economic goals. So you have a brief idea about the whole range of laws. Now I will elaborate that a bit more so that you have a complete viewpoint again. So you'll write down, so I hope you understand this part of the question, that you have to assess, you have to give an account, you have to give assessment, whether the laws and the policies have really been able to balance social objectives with ecological and economic goals. This is your question. So we move on. So the answer, you have an introduction. So 2 or 3 lines on how the forests are important. They're important both for ecology, plus important for tribes. Forests are habitats of forest dwelling, say indigenous population. Okay, so 2-3 lines on the forests have both. And maybe introduction में ही आप लिख देना that pre-independence policies and laws were more exploitative of the social rights. The tribes were denied their rights, and post-independence we continued with 1927 Act. We continued with 1927 Acts. So 2-3-4 line में talk about this. The forests are important, logically important for timber, for fiber, along with their important tribal habitats. The forests are the basis of lot of indigenous population. They support indigenous population. But the pre-independence laws were exploitative. They denied the local rights. But post-independence, we continued with this. Now in 1927 Act, we had classification of forests. Forests classified into reserved forests, classified into protected forests, और एक category था village forests. Don't forget the question, okay? Question says what? That we have to assess जो forest laws रहे हैं, assess the laws that we have. How did they meet the social objectives? What was their performance in terms of social objectives? You have to assess. Don't just give me a list of laws, but tell me how did the laws cater to, how did the laws deliver on social objectives? So keep that in mind. That's why I'm saying that 1927 May, the forests were classified as reserve forests. Reserve forests were very, very restrictive. Human activities were not allowed until some special permissions were given. Protected laws, these were less restrictive relatively, but even then the rights given was very limited. They were giving very limited rights. Some amount of grazing, maybe some amount of collection of firewood, maybe very, very limited rights. Whereas village forests, these were forests which were allocated to villages to meet their forest-based demands. But then these were highly inadequate. Village forests were kind of forests which were allocated to the local tribes. They were allocated to the rural population who lived in the vicinity of the forest to meet their forest-based demands, to meet their forest-based needs. But overall, it says that this provision was very, very restrictive. The provisions were inadequate. So the conclusion is 1927 Act was more or less denying the rights of the local tribes. Okay, so that's one discussion, 1927 Act ke baare mein, 2-3 lines. Then we move on. Then we talk about the 1980, okay, Forest Conservation Act. Now, 1980 Forest Conservation Act was primarily from the ecological perspective. ये देखा आपने? Ecological perspective. This was to reduce, okay, forest loss. This was reduce forest loss. This was to restrict any type of diversion of forest land to non-forest uses. So that this law said that the center had the sole authority in allowing for diversion. Okay, so ecology was important, and in this ecological aspect, again, the tribes and the local population, they were discouraged. Okay, now this law primarily talked about reforestation. It gave the concept of compensatory forestry, और इसी के basis पे we ultimately had, okay, your CAMPA 2000, okay, जो आपका 16 में CAMPA बना, and 19 we had the fund also. So CAMPA जो था, which was compensatory afforestation management, okay, authority, this was set up on the lines of what this law suggested. So the point here is, ये पूरा law was around ecology. This law was around reducing forest loss. It was around restricting diversion of forest. And so much so, the center, so this is an example of, again, centralization. So again, the centralization of forest-based decision making. The center had the sole authority to decide what type of diversions. The center had the sole authority in allowing for diversion. अगर आपको roads बनाना है, अगर आपको dams banana hai, even the state government will not have too much of say. The center will decide, okay, which are the land to be diverted, and the tribal activities and local populations were discouraged. They were discouraged, and the center had the authority. It's something called as de-reservation. I have got reserve forests. Maybe for economic commercial activity, I need to de-reserve the forest. The de-reservation rights authority was only with the center. Example of, there was centralization of forest-based decision making. Okay, centralization of, and it was on these lines that the Act talked about reforestation. The Act talked about compensatory forestry as a concept, and it was on these lines. बाद में 2016-17 में आपका authority बना CAMPA, KAMPA, CAMPA authority for compensatory afforestation and management, okay, protection. Program authority. Yes, this was set up much later on, and the fund was set up in 2019. Okay, so our point is 1980 ka act bhi did not address the local tribes. Okay, so one discussion we had, we assessed that 1927 was not really for the tribes, and 1980 law was also not for the tribes. Then we move on towards the next one. We're assessing what happened with national forest policies, 1952 policy and also 1988 policy. Okay, so यहाँ पर 2-3 lines आएगा that this policy, this was the beginning of acknowledging social and tribal rights. This was the beginning, okay, where we started understanding forests from the perspective of tribal dependence. Okay, we start accepting that forests are important for tribes too. So this was the beginning of acknowledging. And 1952 policy, okay, this talked about social forestry. In fact, you can mention this point here. 88 policy mein, we had to ensure that the local, okay, dependence was acknowledged, and the locals were also encouraged in forest conservation. That's why I said the 88 policy, 52 policy में शुरू हुआ social forestry idea. Social forestry Okay, as an idea was mooted in 52. 88 में, we talked about forests as the basis of tribal economy and also encouraging locals in the forest conservation activities. Now, it says that it emphasized on people's participation. So 88 policy emphasized on people's participation. And a very important word for what? Participation for stabilization of environment and its conservation. Emphasized people's participation for stabilization of the environment. The imbalances hai. Okay, in 88 policy, a very important theme was that forest management should have balanced approach. It should be based on balanced approach. Use the word balanced. Balanced in what sense? You have to balance economic aspect, balance ecological aspect, and also balance the social expectations of the local tribes. So emphasize people's participation for balanced, for harmonious environmental conservation and protection. Okay. So this was assessment. Again, remember, you're going back to the question that we asked, that we have to assess, okay, how has the social objectives been taken care of? So assessing across different laws, 1927 law में आपने ignore कर दिया, okay, 1980 laws में, again, not much was done, but the policies is where we start off with the social element, okay, the balanced approach of the 1988 policy. Now, the most important landmark was the Forest Rights Act 2006. This we say this is the landmark legislation extending forest rights to tribes. Right down 3-4 lines here. It guaranteed ownership rights and it established rules for ensuring 4-5 points. Number one, write down the points, please. Number one is rules for, number one, right to live in the forest. Number two, right to access minor forest produce. Okay. Right to graze, right to land titles, and right to conserve and protect forests. One very important implied right is right not to be arbitrarily displaced by development projects. Right against displacement, right not to be arbitrarily displaced by development projects. So the 2006 Act ensures these rights. That's why I'm saying that this is the most important social objective met under Indian forest laws. The most important law that takes care of the forest rights of different communities. Of course, there are a lot of debates on who are the communities to be given. Usme alag bureaucracy hai. But as an intention, as the objective, okay, this law perhaps has done the most. You can add a point here. Forest Rights Act 2006 was contested as it was feared that the state may not be able to evict encroachments, and the state would not be able to acquire land, forest land, for development projects. Like a lot of criticism that this type of law perhaps will limit the state's authority in acquiring land for development. It is, dekho beta, implementation is always a tricky issue. Implementation always depends on the local governance, the politicians, the local agenda. So it becomes a tricky affair. Okay, forests and forest land plus आपका forest bureaucracy hai, is always going to be some clash. So this question does not require you to get into that debate. Okay, implementation is a suspect almost in all programs of India. ऐसा कोई program नहीं है जहां पर implementation has not been a culprit. Okay, so just keep it at this much. You do not have so much of words or so much of space to elaborate too much beyond this. But the fact was that this law has been criticized, that it is too much of socialism. Now, आज के debate में you are aware of the conversation that we have now. Anything socialist is looked upon very suspiciously. Anything socialist is seen to be anti-development and anti-nationalism. It's anti-country, anti-Indian idea. So that was an idea and that prevails. Okay, that is why, okay, keeping this thing in mind, we have the draft National Forest Policy 2018. Now, this is almost reversing all the work that was done under the 2006. They write a paragraph right down here in response to challenges related to acquisition of forest land for development projects and with the objective of dealing with expanding forest cover in view of increasing deforestation and climate change related challenges. We have the draft National Forest Policy 2018. So 2018 ka primary agenda was to reduce forest loss, to reduce man-animal conflict because of shrinking forests, for developmental projects, and to respond to challenges related to climate change. Under this policy, 3 things were suggested. One is reducing the role of Gram Sabha in consultative process. Second is introducing public-private partnership in forest conservation and in increasing restrictions in forest use. And in the restrictions, there was a greater role for the forest officials. This is almost like, we are again increasing the role of forest bureaucracy. The forest officials, the rangers, they have got higher power so that they can restrict the use of the forest by the local population. That's why we say that this policy is again reversing. So you can add a point here. The draft National Forest Policy 2018 is increasingly seen as reversing the mandate and the scope of Forest Rights Act 2006. It is restricting the implementation of PESA, Panchayat extensions to scheduled areas, and in the role of tribal participation. So the social agenda seems to have been compromised. We will not say we are going back to 27. That's a very, very strong statement. But yes, definitely there's an element that looks like that the social agenda is now getting compromised. The social agenda is now being reversed. Now, as a conclusion, you can write down that you reaffirm that idea that the social objective of forest, as a conclusion, write down, the social component of forest management should not be compromised, but it is a difficult balance to achieve. Indian Forest Act 1927 needs to be drastically amended, community forest rights respected, and the colonial legacy in forest management has to be transformed. It's something that I teach all students that when you write an answer, if it is a current affairs based answer, make sure you appreciate the contextual development. Make sure you appreciate whatever has been the background on the basis of which the topic is asked, the basis of which why that question was asked. So if this question is asked, the contextual basis will be the draft policy, 2018 wala or jo controversies hua hai. So now I've given you the entire write-up. You have to organize that and make sure you keep the answer within about 3 pages. They do not have too much width in everything. Use whatever you can in terms of examples, whatever you can use as part of some schematic depiction, that's your choice.